Hello, welcome to the world of literature. At World of Literature today we would be dealing with a poem titled Mending by Robert Frost. Robert Frost was born in 1874 and he died in 1963. Robert Frost is one of the most famous American poets. He is considered as the greatest American poet of the 20th century. Robert Frost, though, was an American poet, but his poetry was initially published in England. So he became more famous a poet in England than in United States. Robert Frost is a modern poet. He deals with moral issues in his poetry. He deals with rural issues in his poetry. He deals with rustic life in his poetry. Robert Frost was also a type of poet who followed the romantic poets when he was writing the poetry. For example, the romantics like Wordsworth focused a lot upon the rustic life. In the same manner, his themes, his poetry also deals with rustic life. He sets most of his poems in New England. New England is a region in northeastern parts of the United States. It is there that he would set most of his poems. The cultural background, the rural background mostly would be from New England. And then he would explore and write the issues, the complexities of life, the other things in his poetry, but most of them would be based in New England. His poetry usually focuses upon complex social and philosophical issues. Randall Jarrell, a poet, a critic, praised Robert Frost greatly as a 20th century poet. He writes in one of his essays titled 50 Years of American Poetry, which was published in a book titled No Other Book, Selected Essays, that Robert Frost, along with Stevens and Eliot, seems to me the greatest of the American poets of this century. Frost's virtues are extraordinary. No other living poet has written so well about the actions of ordinary men. His wonderful dramatic monologues are dramatic scenes come out of a knowledge of people that few poets have had. And they are written in a verse that uses sometimes with absolute mastery the rhythm of actual speech. That is how Randall Jarrell would praise Robert Frost. He praised him for his grip, for his knowledge, for his information about the social life, about the lives of the people, and then how he translated beautifully, meticulously his experience in his poetry, and how masterfully, how beautifully he represented the problems, the complexities, the issues of life. Robert Frost was a realist poet. He depicted the realism of the society in his poetry. If you have a look at Robert Frost as a poet, so you'll find that he focuses on certain aspects of human life more than anyone else. For example, A, he would focus upon the fundamental questions of existence. B, he will focus upon the loneliness of an individual. C, he will focus upon the dark background of the life. Now, if we have a look at these three things, they were not only dominant themes or dominant areas of exploration in 20th century only in poetry, but there were many other writers around the globe who would be looking at the existential questions of the life. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre would be writing at the same time. We have Albert Camus writing in the same time. They would be writing different genres. Robert Frost writes different genres, but the focus, the area seems to be the same. The loneliness of the human beings in present society are in the 20th century increased manifold post-industrial revolution. How people were too much separated from the domestic lives, separated from the society, separated from the public life, and most of the people then became mere individuals. And as they became individuals, the life on the earth would become very horrible, would become dark, and he will also explore those dark backgrounds of human life. That has been the focus or mission of Robert Frost as a poet. Robert Frost won many awards during his lifetime. He won Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 4 times, and Robert Frost is the only poet to have won Pulitzer Prize 4 times. He won this prize in 1924, in 1931, in 1937 and in 1943. These were the 4 occasions when he would be winning Pulitzer Prize for poetry. Robert Frost also won Congressional Gold Medal in 1960. Robert Frost is known for many notable works or collections of poetry which he wrote, some of them being A Boy's Will, North of Boston, Collected Poems, A Further Range, A Witness Tree. These are some of the notable works, collections of poetry by Robert Frost. Now in this lecture we would be dealing with Mending Wall. Mending Wall is a poem which was published in the collection of poetry titled as North of Boston, which was published in 1914. Now, Mending Wall has become the most famous poem written by Robert Frost, and the collection of poetry North of Boston begins with this poem titled as the Mending Wall. Freeman and Margaret Atwood remarked about this poem in their book titled The Fall of the Wall Between Literary Studies and Linguistics, Cognitive Poetics, that Mending Wall is one of the most anthologized and analyzed poem of Robert Frost. That is the amount of the famousness that this poem achieved. That is how people, the critic, the readers liked this poem titled The Mending Wall. Mending Wall is also based in rural New England as are the rest of the poems. And this poem would be dealing with a very complex issue with the conformity and the non-conformity with the tradition. That would be the basic theme of the poem. ONeill, a famous philosopher and politician, used this poem in preface of his book Justice Across Boundaries, whose obligation published in 2016. That was about Robert Frost and the poem Mending Wall. Now, up next, we would read the text of the poem and then we will analyze this poem line by line, verse by verse, and understand what Mending Wall has to say, or what Robert Frost has to tell us through Mending Wall.